Hello and welcome back to the workshop. In today's video we're going to be looking at brake calipers, changing brake cables and brake pads. Let's get to it. So this is a very conventional Shimano Ultegra front brake caliper. When pulling the lever it should operate smoothly, no roughness in the cable itself, and the caliper should move smoothly outwards when released. So the first thing we're going to look at are brake pads, when to change them. So these ones, apart from being a little high in the rim, we'll come back to that later, look reasonable, but at what point should you change your brake pads? Let's have a closer look at the pads themselves. Here's a brand new one. You can see here quite clearly the deep grooves used for pushing water away from the rim. I like to replace the pads when these grooves have worn away, and these are the replaceable type pads. The holders remain on the calipers. These brake blocks, I suppose is a better name, the pad and holder all in one. And as you can see here, these ones have a wear limit line on the side of the brake pad. To remove the pads, the holder can remain in place, and it's a case of undoing the very small Allen key bolt at the rear of the pad, and I would encourage you to use the square end of an Allen key, not the round end, as this is very small, and the round end, which I'm pointing out now, will likely round off the little bolt, and then it becomes much more difficult to get it out. But by undoing this bolt, it just is a safety mechanism, stops the pads from sliding out. Once that is undone, the old pads can be slid towards the rear of the bike and removed. If the pads have been there a long time through horrible weather, rain and muck, they can be a bit stiff to remove, but these ones have slid out quite nicely. If it's on the front forks, you may have to squeeze the caliper in just to get it past the fork. And here's an example of a well-used pad, the one at the bottom, and some brand new ones at the top, just so that you can see the difference between the two. With both of the pads out, note that the open end of the holders themselves are at the rear of the bike, so obviously the pads don't slide out forwards. Putting a new pad in, they will be left and right orientated. Nearly all pads will have an R or an L on them. Make sure you have them on the right side of the bike. If in doubt, pads sort of curve in a downward shape to match the curvature of the rim, and slide those in from the rear. Same process, front and back. And when sliding the pads in, make sure that they are all the way from key. Bolt needs to meet a recess on the back of the pad. And as soon as you're ready, the two Allen key screws or nuts, bolts, need to be tightened up once more. Just finger tight really anymore, and there is a risk of rounding them off. Next stage is to replace the brake cable. I always advise changing them at least once per year. Existing cable can be undone using the 5mm pinch bolt with a 5mm Allen key. And what I like to do is just cut the end off rather than try and remove that in any way, as it's redundant now, and then the cable can be pulled out via the brake lever and removed. For most brake levers, the end of the cable will be visible when the lever is pulled, but some have a little end cap on the top of the lever there, which will need to be removed before the end of the cable becomes visible. Just push the cable up from the other end, which should expose enough of the cable end so that you can grab it and pull the old cable all the way out. Once the cable has removed, a good time to check that the caliper itself is free, that when released it opens all the way out. If it doesn't, then it will need to be disassembled and greased, and I like to grease all the or lubricate all the pivot points at this point. I also like to squirt some lubricant up through the end of the outer cable. Often these cables are not changed very frequently at all, but if in doubt it's a good time to do it, but it does mean removing the handlebar tape, of course. To insert the new cable, pull the lever down or back towards the bars. The end should find the slot that it needs to go through fairly easily. It may require a bit of fiddling. Push it all the way in and the end will come out through the outer cable. Just grab hold of that, pull it all the way through, and make sure that the end of the cable is seated properly in the lever and that it feels smooth. The cable can now be pushed through the barrel adjuster on the caliper itself, then down to the pinch bolt, the 5mm pinch bolt. Make sure it's pulled all the way through that it's not loose in any way. And at this stage I find it much easier to put the wheel back on. It's easier to adjust the cable tension, and to do that it's best to unscrew the barrel adjuster a couple of turns. Bear in mind, Campagnolo for example, the barrel adjuster goes the other way around, but unscrew it a couple of turns just to push the outer cable away from the caliper. Squeeze hold of the brake pads themselves, pull the cable tight, then do up the pinch bolt. Assuming that your wheel is straight, the wheel will probably drag on both pads fairly evenly. Of course we don't want to do that, but this is where the adjustment of the barrel adjuster, when we put the cable in, becomes quite useful. Now it can be screwed back in a couple of turns, and the pads should just leave enough of a gap on the rim so that the wheel will spin nice and freely. And you may want to set that to a different parameters so that you get a longer lever travel or a shorter one, but just make sure the levers themselves don't come back all the way to the bars under heavy braking. Once the cable is in, adjusted and tightened properly, the end of the cable needs to be cut off with a pair of good cutters, and with the exposed end, a little end cap will just stop the cable from fraying, and this can be crimped on with a pair of pliers. On this example I've deliberately left the cable a little bit too loose, and you can see here that when pulling the lever all the way back, in fact I can see it a little bit more clearly if I use my other hand, but pulling the lever all the way back, you could see that the lever comes right down onto the bar itself, which of course limits the amount of braking force that is available. So this needs to really be adjusted. Tighten the cable up a little bit more, and you can see there that the gap between the pad and the rim is probably a little bit too wide. Could be a bit closer, which will improve the feel and performance of the brake itself. So this is what the little barrel adjuster is for. Squeeze the pads together, just undo the barrel adjuster, in this case anti-clockwise on a Shimano system, tightens the cable up, and once you've got to a point that might suit you, just release the calipers that you're holding with your hand, give the wheel a spin, and make sure that the pads aren't dragging on either side of the rim. If they are, just back it off a little bit as I'm doing now. But do ensure that your wheel is in the middle of the forks, especially with quick release. And here you can see I'm pulling that lever as hard as I can, and the distance between the rear of the lever and the bar is considerably greater than it was before. The final check I like to make is the alignment of the pads themselves, both horizontally and vertically. Here that I'm pointing out, if the pad's too high, it's going to rub on the tyre, which can result in a catastrophic failure of the tyre, a blowout in other words. And if it's too low, it won't be fully on the braking track and may start to wear away the surface of the rim, as this one has just a little bit, but this is a very, very narrow braking track on this particular wheel. Here the pad is clearly too high, it's not touching the tyre yet, but as it wears down, that top edge of the brake pad, which was above the rim, will slowly start to contact the tyre. You should hear that noise, but you might not, but that's not a particularly safe position for that brake pad to be in and needs to be lowered. This, I think, is the easiest way to adjust the pads, the position of the pads themselves. Hold the brake lever tight with one hand, undo the little retaining Allen key bolt here, release the brake lever just enough, and then wiggle the pad into the correct position, not too high, not too low, and importantly this also aligns the pad front to left. You don't really want the rear of the pad touching the rim first, or the front of the pad touching the rim first, unless in some circumstances it's squealing. That's sometimes a good idea, but in essence you want the pad to be parallel with the rim, and you can see if it is parallel just by sight alone with the gap between the pad and the rim. So once you're happy with that, squeeze the lever tight again to hold the pad in place, and just tighten up the little bolt, and repeat again on the other side. And here is a view of a properly adjusted pad. As you can see, the pad itself is parallel with the rim, small gap to allow the wheel to spin freely between the two brake pads. If the wheel isn't perfectly straight, that can cause issues and make brake adjustment quite difficult, so always a good idea to check that. And it's important that the wheel is in the center of the forks and obviously by default the calipers themselves. If it's not quite, sometimes you can just pull the caliper over by hand, as I'm doing here. If not, and that doesn't work, there is a tiny adjustment screw on the top of the caliper for balancing one side to the other. And there we have it, job complete. Wheel spinning smoothly, calipers nicely aligned. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. If there's anything else you'd like to see, please leave a comment.